If you get your contributors to work on high value and high impact things, that's the best way to motivate them. So that's kind of the idea here, is formalize that we have a goal to reduce our footprint. And by virtue of this, we make it a more impactful thing for people to work on by having those numbers, by communicating this specific change to images. Here is the potential for it to reduce emissions.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, where we bring you the latest news and updates from the world of sustainable software development. I'm your host, Chris Adams. If you want the way we build software to be more sustainable and more inclusive, one way to improve the chances of this happening is to make it easier to build it that way. So building greener software goes with the grain of the software framework you're using. And one way to do that is update the defaults that prioritize accessibility and sustainability in the framework itself. One of the people I've seen who really exemplifies this idea and this approach is my guest today, Thibaut Collas, a lead developer at the software agency Torchbox, the current president of the Django Software Foundation, and the product lead at the popular Wagtail content management system, which is also built on top of Django. The Wagtail CMS powers sites like the NASA Jet Propulsion Labs website, the University of Pennsylvania's website, the Tate Gallery, and even the main NHS website in the UK. So while it might not have the same coverage as WordPress, which covers more than a third of the internet, it still powers a large number of large sites, and changes made in this framework can have a decent reach. So changes made here are worth discussing, because that Wagtail CMS docs, in my view, are probably the most advanced talking about sustainability for any open source CMS right now. And there's a clear link between sustainability and embodied emissions of the hardware that people need to use to access your websites too. And with that in mind, you can see that it's got some of the most developed accessibility features as well. But we're getting ahead of ourselves though. And Thibaut is in a much better place to talk about this than me. So Thibaut, thank you so much for joining us. Can I give you the floor to introduce yourself for our listeners?
It's my pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me. I'm Thibaut, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm the product lead for the Wagtail CMS at Torchbox. Wagtail is an open source project and product, and Torchbox, we are the original creators of the project and main contributors. And as product lead, I help shape the work of Torchbox on Wagtail and of other contributors as well. And as president of the Django Software Foundation, I have similar responsibilities for the Django project, Django being a big web framework, one of the biggest on Python. Just to give you a sense of scale, Wagtail, that's on the order of 10 to 20,000 sites out there. And Django, we're talking 500,000 to 1 million projects.
Cool. Thank you, Thibaut. And Thibaut, where are you calling me from today? Because
I'm in Cambridge, UK. Got started with Wagtail way back in New Zealand, but travels took me back to Europe and UK. I'm from France originally.
Oh, cool. All right. Thank you for that. So I'm Chris Adams. I am the co-chair of the Green Software Foundation Policy Working Group. I'm also one of the, we also have show notes for this. So all the projects and links that we discuss will be available. So in your quest to basically develop better sustainable software engineering skills, that will all be available for this. So look up podcast.greensoftware.foundation to find that. All right, Thibaut, we've got a bunch of questions to get through. Shall we start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right. So one thing that really came up on my radar a few years ago when I saw this was that Wagtail was one of the only projects I've seen so far that actually tried to put together a kind of carbon footprint inventory of all of the websites that it's responsible for. And I remember the posts, and we'll share a link to this, explaining some of this and some figures for this. Like, we reckon that Wagtail was kind of responsible for around like more than 8,000 tons of CO2 per year from all the sites that we run. Could you maybe talk a little bit about basically the approach you took for that and why you even did that? because there's probably a few discussions about decisions you had to make and trade-offs you had to choose between model uses and coming up with numbers and all of that. But maybe we go from the beginning about why you started that, then we can dive into some of the details.
Yeah. Well, simply enough, when you start to think about the impact of technology on what we build, as developers, at least we love to try and quantify that impact, put some figures on there. And the carbon footprint of websites, well, when you think of a site, there are lots of components. There's things that happen in the browser, things that happen server side. And when I say server side these days, the infrastructure is quite varied and somewhat opaque as well. So yeah, server side. So when it comes to Wagtail, with it being an open source project, it's quite interoperable with all sorts of databases and file storage and web browsers, obviously. So it becomes quite tricky to actually put a number on the emissions of one site. And I guess that's where we started at Torchbox, specifically trying to quantify the emissions of our clients for 50 to 100 websites. And from there, you realize that it makes lots of sense to try and do it for the whole Wagtail ecosystem so that you can make, hopefully, decisions for the whole ecosystem based on sites out there. So yeah, I think it was back in 2023 that we did this first. And there were definitely lots of ways back then to quantify site emissions. We didn't necessarily reinvent any, but we tried and understand, okay, when we have little knowledge of those thousands of websites out there, which methodologies should we be referring to when we try and put those figures together? So I say specifically methodologies because I think that's one of the potential pitfalls for developers starting in there. They assume that somewhat like performance, you can have quite finite reproducible numbers, but we're just not there yet with the carbon footprint of websites. So I think it's really important that you combine. So in our case, you combine web sustainability guidelines related methodologies. So it's called Sustainable Web Design Model. And that you also combine things that look more closely at the servers, CPU and resource use, and also other aspects in the browser.
Okay, cool. And one thing that I actually quite appreciated when you did this, or when the team you're all part of did this, was that you shared all these numbers, but you also shared the underlying spreadsheets and the working, so that other folks who might be running projects themselves can use as either a starting point or even possibly challenge and propose maybe improvements as we learn more about this, because we know that it's a difficult field to kind of navigate right now, but it is getting a bit easier. And as we learn more things, we are able to kind of incorporate that into the way we kind of model and think about some of the interventions we might make to can we maybe reduce the environmental footprint or improve it, basically.
Yeah. You might actually be aware of a project, Chris, the HTTP Archives Web Almanac. They review the whole of the web on the order of 20 million websites every year, and they produce numbers based on this data set of websites. So that's kind of, I suppose, what I tried to follow with this methodology as well, of sharing our results to the fullest extent, so that other people can verify the numbers and potentially also put same numbers together for their own sites, individual sites, or also site ecosystem. So, Wagtail, it's a CMS among many other CMSs. There's lots of competitors in that space. And nothing would make me happier than seeing other CMSs do the same and hopefully reuse what we've spent time putting together. And obviously when we do this once for Wagtail, we can try and do it also for Django. So there's also this benefit of across the whole tech stack, having that kind of methodology more nailed down for people who make those decisions, like product level decisions.
Okay, cool. And just like we have release cycles for presumably new websites or like new CMSs and everything like that, as we learn more, we might be able to improve the precision and the accuracy of some of this, so to refine some of the assumptions, right? And, many eyes make bugs shallow. So Drupal folks, if you're hearing this, or WordPress folks, over to you, basically.
Exactly. And, definitely the methodologies evolve over time. So one of the recent ones I really like is how with the Firefox browser, you can measure the CPU usage to render a single page. And just that is becoming so much more accessible these days that we could potentially do it on every release of the CMS.
Cool. Well, let's come back to that, because this is one thing that I found quite interesting about some of the work that you folks have been doing is not only were you starting to measure this, but you were looking at actually options you can take to maybe set new defaults or improve some of this stuff. And as I understand it, Wagtail, you've had some luck actually finding some funding and finding ways to basically cover the cost of people to essentially work on this stuff in via things like the Google Summer of Code and things like that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that, because as I understand it, you're in year 3 of successfully saying, hey, this is important, can someone fund it? And then actually getting some funding to pay people to work on this stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So once you have those numbers in place as to, how much emissions the sites out there produce, try and refine it down to a few specific aspects of the sites that, you go through the quick wins, you figure out what you have the most leverage over. And then you realize there's this and that concepts that are potentially quite fundable if you know just how to frame it and who to talk to. And we, as Torchbox, we have quite a few clients that care about the footprint of their websites. But it's definitely also a good avenue. The Google Summer of Code program you mentioned, it's about getting new people started with open source as new contributors in the open source space. It's entirely funded by Google. And essentially, Google, they trust projects like Wagtail and Django to come up with those ideas that are, impactful and also sensible avenues for people to get up to speed with open source. And so, it's been 3 years now that we've done this with a sustainability focus, where we try every year to have an idea in this space. And I think it's quite interesting as an option because few people that come to open source, early in their career are aware of sustainability. It's quite a good opportunity for them to learn something very, very new, even if they might already know the technology like Django and Wagtail. And for us, it allows us to work on those concepts that, we saw the data, we saw the promise. So I think the first year we did, 2023, we looked at image optimization. It's actually quite a big thing for a CMS, in my opinion, at least, that, people want to add lovely visuals to all of their pages. And, maybe sometimes there is a case for fewer images if you want to lower the footprints. But there's definitely also a case where you have to have images. You want them to be as low footprints as possible. So for that specific project, we were joined by 2 contributors who helped us. One worked on AVIF support in the CMS, AVIF being one of the newer image formats that promises to have a lower file size than the alternatives. And the other one helped us essentially make the APIs we have in Wagtail to generate multiple images, make that more ergonomic. So you'd be able to generate, say, 3 different variations of an image and then only send to the user the one that fits the best for how the image is displayed.
Oh,
so that hopefully it's smaller. So it's this responsive images concept.
Oh, I see. So you basically it may be that the server needs to generate some of these images because you don't have control over who's accessing your website. But when someone's accessing something with maybe a small, like a touch device or something, run this in a massive thing over the wire, you can send something which is appropriately smaller. So it might take up less space inside the memory and the DOM and less over the wire as well, right?
Exactly. You were talking about the grain of Wagtail. Wagtail has very few opinions as far as how you create the pages, but we definitely try and leverage the grain of HTML, I suppose. So this responsive images pattern is quite well put together in HTML and web standards. And really happy with the results. Honestly, I think for the specific trial sites we rolled it out, it was on the order of 30% lower page weight. And for the Wagtail web out large, like every year we see the improvements in those audits about how much usage there is of modern image formats, how much usage there is of responsive images. We see the figures improve. So really cool.
Cool. We should actually share links to some of these things as well, actually, because one of the wonderful things about working with an open source project is you can say, well, if you want this to be a norm, then here's the PR you could copy, basically, right?
Exactly, yeah. And something like AVIF support, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point. Definitely, we couldn't create the AVIF decoders and so on ourselves, so we've been relying on the Python ecosystem at large. And now those things are in a place where lots of projects have those decoders well available.
Cool. Are there any other so that was year one and this is year three. And I think I can probably share with you is that, so we're a non-profit organization. We publish a library called CO2JS. We've managed to get some funding from Google once for the Google Summer of Docs, not Google Summer of Code, where they actually funded us to make some of this library a bit easier for other people to use. And we found that quite helpful because that's been one of the ways people come to this for the first time is they use a library called CO2JS, and that wasn't something we could prioritize. So it's kind of nice. It would be nice if there's more organizations funding this kind of work rather than just like one web giant. Like it's nice that Google is doing this, but if you too work in a large tech company and you want to actually fund this stuff or make it easier for your engineers to do this, then yeah, it's right there, folks. Okay. So maybe I can ask about some of the other years that you have running. Like, is there anything else you'd like to talk about or draw people's attention to? Some of the other ones.
Google Summer of Code is a 3-month program, but lots of those things, to be honest, they keep chugging along in the background for quite a while and making improvements. So year 2 of this, we worked on a starter project for Wagtail, so a starter website where just like, as you mentioned earlier, the defaults, trying to make sure that it's easier for people to get a site up and running that has all of the right things in place to be low impacts. So that time, our contributor Nandini helped us with the designs as well as the coding of these templates. And just from the get-go, the idea was, let's measure the designs even before they touch a web browser. Let's make sure that we understand all of the newer standards like the Web Sustainability Guidelines, that those designs have that baked in, so that when you generate the site, you are guaranteed better results. So this project template is still in progress, but the designs, at least, they're super promising. And year 3 starting as of this week, just to be clear, is grid awareness. So grid awareness is a big term. Essentially, it means looking at ways that as the website loads in your browser, it'll be optimized based on the carbon intensity of your computer and your local grid electricity. So what that means is if it would produce lots of emissions for the site to load in your browser, we try and make the website optimized for the emissions to lower. So our contributor for this, Rohit, he's been around the Wagtail community for a bit and has this interest in sustainability. And again, it's, I think, a great example of something that will tangibly help us reduce the impact of Wagtail websites out there, and also make more developers aware of those patterns and the underlying need for those patterns.
I'm glad you mentioned the names, actually, because on the initial year, I was working with Aman Pandey, and I think one of your colleagues might be working with Path. So hi, Path. Hi, Aman. Lovely. I hope you're listening. It's really nice to actually see this, because these were people who are, like you said, early career, didn't get that much exposure. But honestly, compared to like the industry, they're relative experts now. And that might say more about the state of the industry is right now. But this is something I actually found it quite nice working with someone who was relatively young, who was actually really, really keen and honestly worryingly productive. Did make me worry a bit about my own job going forward. But yeah, this was one thing that was really cool from that, actually.
Parth and Aman are 2 of the mentors working with me on this Grid Aware Websites project this year. So this is also the other goal of this Google Summer of Code program, is retaining those people in the open source world. And definitely, we are at a point now where we have more and more of those people coming to open source with that realization. There's way more room for this to happen on other projects like Wagtail, but baby steps.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that you actually there was a kind of program to kind of build, invest in, provide some of that leadership, so people who prioritize this are able to kind of have a bit more of influence inside that project, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Well, open source, we have very different incentives compared to the corporate and for-profit world. So we don't necessarily have super clear ways to retain people, but definitely people who are interested and have the drive. Like, we try and retain them by having them move from contributors first time to repeat maintainers, mentors, and so on.
Oh, cool. All right. So that is a nice segue to allow us to talk a little bit about, I guess, taking ownership of carbon emissions and like the strategies that you have there. Because one thing we should add into this list is that there's actually a roadmap for Wagtail specifically. I think it's, is it RFC 90, or is there a particular term for like a request for comments or something that you folks use to kind of talk about governance and talk about what you prioritize in this?
It's a bit of a running joke, in Python, they have the PEP proposals, Python enhancement proposal, and in Django's, they have the DEPs. People have been wondering if Wagtail should have the WEPs, but right now we just have RFC requests for comments. And it's just a super simple way for us to invite. It's really rather than, create those governance or technical architecture decision documents in private chats, put them in public, and then invite feedback from others. So, we've had this RFC for a couple of years now, I believe. I got some good support from one of the experts out there on open source governance, Laurie Apple. She coached me through, trying to build up community momentum and also trying to find ways to make this reusable again beyond Wagtail. And so this RFC, if you're deep in this space, it's nothing super special. It's about building awareness, finding opportunities for fundraising, working on the right concepts. But I think it's quite unique for open source projects to have that kind of clear direction for those things. Open source projects don't even necessarily have a roadmap of any kind to start with. And one on specific topics like this, I think is really important. I think there's something Laurie says often, which is if you get your contributors to work on high value and high impact things, that's the best way to motivate them. So that's kind of the idea here, is formalize that we have a goal to reduce our footprint. And by virtue of this, we, make it a more impactful thing for people to work on by having those numbers, by communicating, this specific change to images. Okay. Here is the potential for it to reduce emissions.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I've just followed the link to the RFC that you have here, and there's actually quite a lot of stuff here. So I can see a link to the free Green Software for Practitioners course for people who don't know that much about it. I can see that Wagtail itself has a sustainability statement. So these are our priorities. So there's some immediate kind of explicit statement that this is something you care about. And then, as I understand it, there's some references to other things. So there's the prior work, with the GSOC, Google Summer of Code. There's references to the W3C Web Sustainability Guidelines, and a bunch of stuff like that. And there's a few other. We'll show a link to this because I think it's actually a really good example for other people to be aware of, or see this is what a relatively large, mature project does, and this is what it looks like when they start prioritizing this. Because there are some organizations that are doing this quite well. I know that there is a .NET based CMS that I've totally forgotten. Umbraco
yes.
CMS also have some quite strong, have also quite advanced in this. And they're another good example of this. But there's kind of, when you talk about, prioritizing this and responsibility, there's a whole question about, whose job is it, or who's responsible for this? Because you're building a piece of software and you might not get that much control over who adopts the software. For example, I think when you shared this breakdown, we saw I think you mentioned there was one Vietnamese website, Vinmec, that was making up a third of the reported emissions. Yeah.
Put me in touch.
Yes.
Yes. So this is a very, with the caveat that carbon accounting isn't my expertise. In the corporate world, we have the very clear greenhouse gas GHG protocol and scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 standards. And in that corporate world, I think that there's this, scope 3, category 11, use of products. Yeah. It's worse than that. It's use of sold products.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, sold. Yeah.
So if you're not a corporation, we're not a corporation, Wagtail. We have about 20 contributors on the core team. And if you don't sell your product, which standards are you meant to be using then to decide essentially which emissions we should be reporting on? So this figure of the carbon footprint of Wagtail on the order of 5 to 10,000 tons a year, that's assuming we take some ownership for this usage of Wagtail and of the websites built with it. And it's actually, I think, quite tricky to navigate in the open source world, understanding which standards of reporting are helpful because, in some respects, people who shop for a website builder, a CMS, or any tech really kind of expect specific standards to be met. You mentioned having a sustainability statement. no one's expecting that just yet in the open source world, but we definitely want things to move that way. And we have to, make sure that when we create those figures, they are somewhat comparable to other projects. So yeah, I guess for Wagtail, there's the fact that you don't control who uses it, and you don't control how they use it either. So if someone wants to, make a site that's particularly big and it's particularly popular in some country, maybe it's adult entertainment websites that I don't have any.
Does Pornhub go on WordPress's ledger, right? Is it on their accounts? Yeah.
Exactly. We have a few like these in the Wagtail and Django world. Yeah. And the technology, it's open source license. We have no interest in taking any kind of control or having a more contractual relationship with those projects, but we still need to navigate how to account for their use, essentially. What actually got me started on this, Chris, I think it's worth a mention, is the work of Mozilla and Mozilla Foundation. They were the first ones I saw, I think, back in 2020, reporting the use of Firefox browser as part of the emissions of Mozilla. And I think it was 98% of the emissions of Firefox were the emissions of Mozilla came from Firefox. And it just got me thinking, for Wagtail and Django, obviously it's a similar type of scale.
Also with Firefox, the browser, you don't necessarily pay Firefox to use it, but you may be paying via the fact that your attention, you kind of pay in your attention, and the fact that when you click on a search, an ad in Google or one of the search services, Firefox is being paid that way. So you're not actually making a direct monetary, you're not giving them money directly, but there is payment taking place and changing hands. And this is one thing that is actually quite difficult to figure out. Okay, how do you represent that stuff? Because like you said, it's not sold per se, or you're not paying in money, but you may be paying in something else, for example. And it's almost like, this, I guess it's a good thing that you do see some of these protocols for reporting being updated, because they're not necessarily a good fit for how lots of new business models on the internet actually work, for example.
Yeah, and it's really important for us to get in this space as open source technologists, I believe, because I mentioned procurement. Definitely the expectations are rising in Europe, in particular in the EU, on the carbon impact of technology. And I think it's quite a good opportunity for open source. We have very high transparency standards for us to meet those requirements, not necessarily to lower the emissions dramatically, but at least be transparent on the impact of the software.
Yeah, this is actually, you touched on quite an interesting thing, which is both a link to some of the Mozilla work, but also in the kind of AI world, which is kind of adjacent to us as webby people. There's I know that Mozilla provided a bit of funding to Code Carbon, which is an open source Python library for people to understand the environmental footprint of AI training. And I think these days some inference as well via the kind of Energy Score AI project that they have with Hugging Face, for example. So one of the reasons you have that is because, oh God, I'm going to murder the name. There's a French supercomputer, Jean Paul. Oh, do you know the one I'm talking about?
No, I don't actually.
Right. Okay, so maybe the thing I'll do is I'll give you a chance to respond to this while I look it up. But I do know that one of the reasons we have any numbers at all for the environmental footprint of AI was because there was a publicly funded supported supercomputer with some work by some people at Hugging Face. I forget the Bloom mod.
The Bloom project.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. That we have these numbers, and there was a paper produced to actually highlight, because the supercomputer, the people who are running the supercomputer were able to share some of these numbers, where traditionally we've had a real challenge getting some of these numbers back. So that's one place where having some open examples at least give us something like a proxy in the face of not quite deafening silence from groups like OpenAI and Anthropic and stuff like that, but we're not seeing that much in the way of numbers. And given that we're seeing this massive build out, it's definitely something I'm very, very glad it's useful to have open source projects and some other ways of funding this to actually at least create some data for us to have a kind of data-informed discussion about some of this.
100%, yeah. This Bloom large language model is I think really essential for us to see this research being done, because then when people talk about adding AI in a CMS or in their Django projects, we can point them to understanding, like, what the potential increase in the carbon footprint of the project is. And in the AI world, there's this whole debate about what open source means for AI models. Definitely, it's not. There's lots of gray areas there, but if you want to reuse their research, it's much easier if there's just an underlying philosophy of open source and open data in those organizations.
Jean Zay, that's the name of the supercomputer in France, which has this. There's actually ones in Boston as well. There is one over there, and in the US, NREL, the National Renewable Energy Labs folks, they've shared a bunch of information about this as well when they've got access to this. And this is actually providing a bit of kind of light to a discussion which is mostly about heat so far, it seems. So that's actually kind of useful. You've just made me realize that later on this year, this might be one of the angles that we might see people talking about the use of AI for actually drilling for oil and gas and other kind of stuff which is not great for climate, because Eni, which is it's a state-owned Eni is a state-owned energy company in Italy. They are one of the few people who actually have a publicly owned supercomputer. And because Italy is one of the countries that signed the Paris Agreement, there's currently a whole court case about essentially suing Eni to say, well, if you're state-owned and this is and you signed this, why the hell are you actually now using AI to drill for oil and gas, for example? And this might be one of the ways that we actually see some numbers coming out of this, because since 2019, we know that there are companies which are doing things with this. But for example, we know that, say, companies like Microsoft are involved in helping use these tools to kind of get oil and gas and fossil fuels out of the ground. But there's not much there's not much out there right now since the press release stopped in 2019, and it feels like it's a real gap we have when we talk about sustainability and technology, and particularly AI, I suppose.
Yeah, that's really interesting for us to consider for Wagtail as well, because we talk about the carbon footprint of a website, but it's also important to consider what the website might be enabling, or in positives and negatives. And even beyond websites, when I've tried to take my work from Wagtail to Django and even the Python ecosystem at large, with Python, you have to reckon with the footprint of web services built with Python, but also of all the data science that supports this same, oil and gas industry. So it's tricky.
Yeah, I mean, we've just seen, like, we're speaking on the 4th of June, and we had there 2 days ago, and we've seen like a massive drone attack wiping out like a third of Russia's bomber fleet, right? And that was basically like some Arduino drone pilot software was one of the key pieces that was used inside that. And it's not necessarily like the open source developers, they didn't build it for that, but we're now seeing all this stuff show up. And like, we haven't figured out ways to kind of talk about where the responsibility lies or how you even think about some of this stuff, because this takes we might have words like dual use for talking about these kind of technologies, but in a world of open source, it becomes much, much, much harder to figure out where some of these boundaries lie and how you actually, set some norms. I mean, maybe this is actually one thing. Yeah, I'll leave you some space. Then I want to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned the wider Python ecosystem, because I know that's something you've actually been having some conversations with as well.
Yeah, well, connecting the dots, it's also the usage, but also as contributors, you have to consider that maybe there are only so many people in the Wagtail or Django world that are responsible for how the tech is put together. So maybe in some sense, you do share some kind of responsibility personally for the tech you produced out there, even though you don't control how people reuse it, which is, a whole dimension of how you or how much you take ownership of that. And in the Python world more widely, Python's the most popular language out there. Even if it might not be the most performant, even if there might be simpler languages that help you get more optimized, lower emissions software. People are going to use Python in all sorts of ways, and some of them you agree with, and some you don't. I think that's one of the realities of open source contribution you have to be aware of.
You've actually said something quite interesting about, there's a limited number of people inside the Wagtail community, and you've been able to have some success in like helping set some norms or help kind of set some directions there. And there's maybe a slightly larger group, which is like in the Django land, like when with you in the kind of acting as a president now. I know there's some interest that you have there, and there's groups that I've been involved with, right? But you also mentioned that there's a kind of wider Python ecosystem of people talking about this. I mean, if someone is actually looking, let's say they're coding in Python, they want to find out who else is doing this, like, is there someone you'd point people to, or are there any conversations you're aware of going on right now?
The Python ecosystem is big. So one of the big challenges to get started with is just putting enough people together to have those discussions. I have tried. I have tried on the Python discussion forum. I think it's who's working on sustainability in Python is the thread I put together. And I think to me, what's important at this point is just getting tech people, aware of the fact that we have this climate change challenge and that they can do something about it. And then, realizing that open source has a role to play. And as open source contributors, we can very much move the needle. So in the Python world, it being so big and the uses being so different, there are lots of ways to help by working on the performance of Python itself, but there are also lots of ways to help outside that. Even something as simple, as the Python Software Foundation trying to quantify their own organization footprint, or the footprint of a conference like PyCon US, that can go quite a long way, I think.
Cool. Thank you for that. Actually, I'm really glad you mentioned PyCon US, because there were a number of talks that I heard other people on other podcasts talking about it. They were really pleased to see. So there does seem to be some latent interest there. And what we could do is we'll share a link to some of the videos that were up there, because I was pleasantly surprised to see them when I saw PyCon's videos come up on YouTube, because wow, it came up really fast. Like, there is, really nice things about like design pressure and how to think about like your code. But there's a few people saying who are totally new to, like, I've been, the existing green software field. There are people who seem to be quite new to it talking about this. So that's encouraging. Yeah.
And in some ways, AI, the whole negative impacts of AI, the whole like problem and kind of forms for our whole industry. But with, large language models being so costly to train, so, energy intensive to train, in some ways it also helps people understand better the implications. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And just build up awareness. So I think what you refer to at PyCon US is the work of Apoorv Garg.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, machine learning in Python, quantifying the energy impact of that, and LLM specifically. And people like him, he's involved with Google Summer of Code for Django. So definitely in a position. That. Yeah. And I think it's just it's a matter for us as open source people of nurturing, those areas of expertise, making sure we have those people having the conversations, and so sharing them in a wider sphere of the industry at large.
And I suppose, one of the other things is that pretty much all the people you've mentioned who are going through the Summer of Code stuff, these are people who are in one of the regions which is seeing like 50 degrees Celsius heat waves and stuff like that. There's kind of like moral weight that comes from someone talking about to say, hey, I'm experiencing this stuff and I'm in an area which is very, very much exposed to this, in a way that if you're in some way you're somewhat insulated from a lot of these problems, it might not carry the same weight actually. Wow, thank you. I hadn't realized that.
I really liked this parallel that one of my colleagues at Torchbox put together about our work in accessibility and the war in Ukraine, talking about other big topics, where, practically speaking, there is a war. It's horrendous. People are getting maimed and they don't necessarily have the same life after. And if you invest in accessibility, it means being better able to support people who go through the conflict with major harm. And I think it's quite important for us in open source, when Laurie talks about high impact contributions, to hark back to those values you might have about helping others and realize the connection, even though, there are quite a few layers between me and any one contributor and a Wagtail website, we can have that impact.
Well, I guess that's the whole point of the web, right? The web this is for everyone. Like London Olympics, Tim Berners-Lee, his like massive thing. This is for everyone, being a kind of, okay, we're getting a bit teary and a bit carried away with ourselves, and we're running short on time. So I should probably kind of wrap this up before we go too far down that rabbit hole. Thibault, thank you so much for coming on for this. As we wrap up, are there any projects or things that you would like to draw people's attention to that you found particularly exciting of late before we wrap up?
Definitely, I'd recommend people check out this Great Aware website's work that the Greenway Foundation puts together.
I did not tell him to say that. Okay.
Yes,
thank you. Yeah,
he did not. But, it is actually really impactful in my mind to put together multiple CMS partners through these projects. And on a personal basis, this type of project, I was really skeptical of the benefits at the beginning. And it's really interesting to get your thought process starting on, like tangible ways to move the needle on new sites, but also existing ones. So specifically the work we're doing for this project with Google Summer of Code, I think we'll have results to show for it in about a month's time. And hopefully it's reusable for other people.
Yeah, there is actually, okay, now that you mentioned this, I was just going to touch on it. There is actually a GridAware SDK, which is currently out there. And you can think of GridAware as being very ways kind of like quite comparable to Carbonware, basically, but with a few extra different nuances. The thing I should probably share is that this is actually work that has had a degree of funding from SIDN, which is a Dutch foundation that has been trying to figure out what to do in like greening the internet. So there are pockets of interest if you know where to know who to speak to, and hopefully we should see more of these things kind of bearing fruit over the coming months. All right, I don't want to spend too much time talking about that because we're coming up to time. Thibault, thank you so much for giving us your attention and time and sharing your learnings about both in the world of Django, Python, and in Wagtail. If people are curious about what you're up to, where should people look?
Simply enough, I'd love for them to join yet another thing you didn't ask me to mention, which is the Climate Action Tech Slack. This is my favorite place to, have this tight-knit community of tech people working on this stuff, and just DM me there, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions about any of this, or just get you started with your own projects. For me specifically, otherwise in the Wagtail world, the Wagtail newsletter is a good place to have this work come to you on a weekly basis. And just LinkedIn otherwise.
Brilliant. Thibault, thank you so much for this. I hope you have a lovely day. And hopefully we'll cross paths again soon. All right. Take care of yourself.
Pleasure, Chris.
Cheers. Okay. Bye. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.